What's going on, you guys? Welcome back to the channel, and today's video is going to be designing this RGB color designer app inside of Python. Okay, so the purpose of this app is almost every application, whether using C# or Python or a plugin or anything else, most colors in the computer are either hexadecimal or RGB. RGB being essentially this just list of three coordinates that can be 0 to 255, 0 to 255, 0 to 255 for an R value, a G value, and a B value, meaning red, green, and blue. And needing to know specific colors and design for your colors is a really useful tool. And then this is a fun Python exercise as well to understand how colors and designing colors works. So this project is going to be basically divided up into three main pieces. We're going to start by setting up our Pygame module and just creating kind of the framework that'll allow us to have a graphical user interface. The second piece is going to be drawing all of the specific things we'll need for our application into the window. And then the third piece, which is going to go pretty quickly, is just handling the user input so that you can actually interact and change your colors. So without any further ado, let's get into it. All right, so the first part is setting up the Pygame game. And to start, you always are just going to import Pygame. You may need to run pip to install it. If you want to use something else like tkinter or Kivy to do this same type of project, you can. Pygame is just super user friendly, and so if you're going to do it on a computer, then this is not a bad way to go about it. And then do pygame.init to initialize it. And what I always like to do is drop a few colors just right away. So I know this is a color app designer, so it might not make sense, but actually I think if we just make like white, black, and let's do red, green, and blue real quick. That's gonna give us a few colors so that when we want to type these things onto the screen, we don't have to put an RGB value. We can just reference the variable that's storing it. And that'll make more sense in just a second when we get to the piece of actually writing stuff onto the screen. But okay, a few things you're going to do every time you do a Pygame project. You're going to want to create a font if you're going to have any text at all in the game, which almost every game is. And to do that, you do whatever variable name you're giving it. I just call mine font, pygame.font.font with a capital F. And that only needs two arguments. It needs the font file name, and I like to use free sans bold because it's built in with Python, at least my Python install. But you can import a TTF file for your own font. And then a font size, so I'll give it 40, and then that's going to be pretty big, so I will also just make a small font. And this is what you're going to have to do if you want different text sizes. So like you want some key title text and then you also want some secondary text, you have to make separate fonts for each of those. So it's just the exact same, pygame.font.font, and then give it a name, free sans bold.ttf. And we'll make this one 20. We'll make it half the size of the other one. Okay. And now we're going to do pygame.display.set caption. So this is the text that pops up at the top of your window, and you just want to give it a title that'll, you know, tell the person what kind of app they're in. And so this will be an RGB color picker. And then the next piece is you want to create your actual screen. So the size of the window that you're going to have, pygame.display.set mode. And then all you have to do is in these square brackets for a list, all you have to do is give it a width and a height. Now you could just type values in here. I like to make my window scalable, so I usually put width and height into variables, and I like doing it that way. So we'll do width of 700, height of 600, and you can kind of see after we design this, as long as we design it the right way, you can just come up here, change those variables, and as long as everything's position in our window is referencing those variables, then we can immediately resize it without having to change the layout. So that's a super useful tip. And then last thing before we get into actually like having the screen on screen is you want to set up a timer, and you want to set that equal to pygame.clock with a capital C, I believe. Pygame.time.clock with a capital C. And this clock is going to be what controls the speed of your game, along with, you could just punch it in again, but I'm going to put a frame rate in FPS in a variable, and we're going to use that right away. So let's go ahead and actually create the game loop now. Set this variable running equal to true when your game starts up, and then say while running. So this is, you don't need a colon there. So this is how you set up what I like to call the main game loop, and you're going to do this for every Pygame game. You're going to, whatever conditions, there may be you want a menu to load up when the game starts, and you don't actually start until you hit like the start button on that menu. Whatever it is, once that button has been initialized, you use a while loop, and everything inside of the while loop is going to be like your main game actions. Okay? And so just to get a screen up, we'll do timer.tick at our frame rate, and then we'll do screen.fill. And here's where you could just type in, because all you need to do here is give it a color. You could just type in 000, but I like to, especially for troubleshooting, I like to immediately be able to look back and see like, well, what did I say would be going in here, and all these different variables. So we're just going to say screen.fill with black. And then let's just kind of get the game to a point where we can open the screen up, and then we can start building it from there. We'll kind of enter the second phase of the build. So we're going to create what's called like event handling. And so it'll be for event in pygame.event.get, and if event.type. So the event.get is getting everything that's happening in your computer, internally and externally, if it's something that you can change. So mouse button clicks, keyboard button clicks, special characters, function buttons, pygame.event.get is grabbing all of those events. So we need to start parsing it out into different ones. And the X button, the button that automatically pops up in your screen window at the top right, is called pygame.quit. And so we want, if you hit the quit button, we want to set running, that variable that controls whether or not our game is active. We just want to set that equal to false. And then the last things we need to do to get our screen ready is just pygame.display.flip. Let me verify. I think it's pygame.display.flip. Yep. And then pygame.quit. And just like that, when I hit play, unless I've made a mistake, which is possible, yep, we get a 700 by 600 window. I accidentally minimized Python. But we get a 700 by 600 window, and now we have Pygame set up. We have a frame rate. We have a screen with adjustable width and height. We have some colors. We have a timer. We have fonts. And we're ready to enter phase 2, which is actually drawing our window for color designing. Okay, so my thinking for RGB color design is obviously we want to show the R, G, and B values on the screen, and they're going to act exactly the same as one another. So what I want to do is I want to create a class that I'll call color button. So I'm just going to say class, capital C, color, capital B, button. Classes usually get the capital treatment, even though nothing else in Python really does. And then to initialize it, it's always def, and then underscore, underscore, init, underscore, underscore. And here's where you start passing in variables. So for a button, we'll want it to, you always are going to start with self. But for a button, we'll want to give it a color. We'll want to give it an X position that we want to get drawn at, a Y position we want to get drawn at. We'll say how wide we want the button. We'll say how tall we want the button. And we'll give it some text. And I think for now that's where we'll start. So those are things that every button is going to need to share in common. Okay, and so in this init function, all we're really going to do is take those variables that we'll be passing in and set them equal to things that we can use inside the function without having to put self before it every time. Oh, I got my indentations wrong. There we go. So you just can do self dot, and then every variable that we just said will be getting passed in, every parameter, just do self dot that parameter and set it equal to essentially the same name, something logical that you can use inside of your function, and you'll see why this is nice once we get to the drawing piece of it. Okay, self.tall, and you could say width and height. It's just typically I try to avoid using the same verbiage in the outside world that I use inside of my classes, just to keep straight where each thing is coming from. Okay, and now let's go down into define. So one thing I want every button to be able to do, I just want it to be able to draw itself by just calling it. So I'm going to say define draw and then self. And what we want is we want to say self.rect. So we want to draw a rectangle for each button and set it equal to this built-in Pygame function of pygame.draw.rect. And then we want everything to go onto the screen. And now we start giving it some of the variables that we made. So self.color, that's going to be what color it goes at. And then the rectangle takes 4 arguments. It takes an X position, it takes a Y position, and you probably see where this is going. It takes a width, self.wide, and it takes a height, self.tall. Okay, so it's not an accident that we created this class to pass in the exact variables. We're going to need to draw this class. But then the next things we do, if you want it to be solid for width, because that's edge width, you just put a 0, and that's going to mean that it's a completely solid object. If you put a value in there, it's going to be a hollow rectangle. And then we'll give it rounded edges because that looks nice, I suppose. Okay, and let's go ahead and do one more thing. Let's say button text is equal to the font.render. So here's now how you draw text on the screen. It's a 2-piece process. First, you self.text. First, you set your text equal to a variable. So we'll call this button text. But then you do font that you set up in the beginning .render, and then you want to make sure whatever it is that you're writing in is going to be a string. So hopefully the text that's getting passed in is already in string format. If it is, adding this str isn't going to hurt it, but if it's something else like a number or any kind of special character, this will convert into a string. So just to be careful, I like to add the str there. Inside of a class, inside of a function, you never know what you're going to get passed in, and so it's not a bad idea to just be careful. And make sure it gets converted to a string. Okay, and then true, and then we'll say the text will be black and none. Okay, and so now the second piece of how you draw text onto the screen, screen.blit, and then it'll be that button text we just defined, and then we'll want to put it in the X position, Y position, just like the button. But if you think about text, you don't want it to be exactly on the edge. That looks kind of funky. So here's a good spot to play around with your values. I'm going to move it to the right 20 and down 20 just to get it off center, but you can play around with this and change it more if you want. So I think that's enough initial setup. Let's actually get some buttons on the screen here. So after we fill the screen, we're going to create 3 buttons. We're going to create an R button, a G button, and a B button. Okay. And we got to think about the variables we just said we need. So the first thing to do is set them equal to the class. So it'll be color button. That's what we called it. And then the first thing is a color. And it's even how if you're using a good IDE like I'm using PyCharm, it'll look at that function in that class and it'll tell you what variables it needs. So for the R button, it needs red. And then it says, okay, we need an X position. Well, let's say this is going to be the first button and we want these 3 buttons to be title buttons that span the width of the screen. This one is going to be our first one. So it'll start at 0, 0. That's going to be our X position and our Y position. And then, remember I said we should make this to where it's quickly, easily scalable for any size. We'll do width divided by 3 so that it's 1/3 of the screen. And then we don't have to make it scalable for the height because it's just going to be a title bar. So as long as we're sure that 100 pixels looks good for these buttons, we don't care how high they make the screen. It would actually make it look weird if it was getting stretched too much. So we'll do height of 100. And then for the text, I think we should create a variable because this is something we'll be changing as we change colors, and we'll call it our value. And to start, let's just go up to where we have all of our variables, initialize our value, and we'll just set them all equal to 0 initially. So since we're here, let's do G value. And you can see right away I'm creating these as numbers because that's how RGBs are going to work. We need them to be integers, but we want the text to display on screen. So right away that str conversion that we're doing is a super useful add. But let's go ahead and copy this, and we'll just do the same thing for G and B. And hopefully what we'll see is just a red, green, and blue button. All three of them are going to say 0 with the text, but they should take up the whole screen. So we just have to change the X and the Y coordinates a little bit. Actually, we don't have to change any of the X coordinates. But what we do have to do, the green button, we want to start at width over 3. And the blue button, we want to start at 2 times width over 3, right? If you need to, you can pull up like a graph and see the grid, but this should make sense. The first one starts at 0. The second one starts at 1/3 of the width of your screen, and the last one starts at 2/3 the width of your screen. So let's just run this. And well, actually, yeah, I'll go ahead and run this, but you're going to see nothing comes up on the screen yet because we put the drawing in a separate function. So it's going to be our button dot draw, and you have to, if you're going to put drawing something in a separate function than just the root, which is the right way to do it, just make sure after you create your buttons you also call the draw function and you put them inside the main game loop so that it's happening every iteration. So let's go ahead now and see. All right, that looks pretty good. We have the R, G, and the B. And so far, you know, we haven't made it to where the user can interact with them, but we're getting everything in place to start. So I think that looks pretty good. That's a good start. Now let's go ahead and display the window. So just a really good way to do Python stuff is to separate as much functionality as you can into sub-functions and call them, rather than gum up your main game loop with a ton of functions. So let's just start drawing the window in a function that we'll call draw window. And this needs to be outside of your class. It's separate from your button class. And I think the reason I did the buttons is going to become clear, the buttons as a separate thing from this window and instructions and stuff, because we're interacting with those and we're not actually directly interacting with the window. Coffee break. Okay, so to get started, let's just let's start making it feel like an application. Let's get a line that goes across right underneath our buttons, so draw a line, screen, let's make this one white, and let's have it start at 0, 100, so that's going to be right at the bottom of the buttons that we just made, and let's have it just go 2. So to draw a line, you give it 2 values. You just give it a starting point and an ending point. That's all a line needs to fully define its position. And then you give it a width. So we'll make it 3 just so it really pops. And that right there, we should already see a line if I start this up. Yep, and you can see this little white line that just divides the button section from now our operating window. Okay, so we drew a line. Let's go ahead and draw the actual window. So we're gonna put the color that you've selected with your R, G, and B values. We're gonna put those pygame.draw.rect screen, and we'll make a screen that uses those 3 colors. So we'll put it on the screen. Let's give it a border, and let's say it'll be white, and then it'll start at, let's go width divided by 10, and then we'll just see how that looks. So that's going to be 1/10 of the width of the screen, just to give it a little cushion on the left side. And then we'll say height divided by 4, So that gives it a little cushion from the top. That's just X and Y starting position. And if you don't like where these are, play around with them. That's a great exercise in understanding how Pygame works. And then we'll make it take up 80% of the screen, so that'll give it a 10% screen cushion on either side. Like I said, this is going to be just immediately resizable, and that'll be a really useful feature. Okay, so with 80% of the screen, and then let's go ahead and say for the height, we'll just make it 50% of the screen. So height times 0.5. Alrighty, and now this one, I do think we'll want it to be hollow. So I'll go ahead, instead of putting a 0 there, I'll put a 10 there, and that'll give it a border size of 10. Okay, and we can put our color now, whatever color has been designed with RGBs, inside of that rectangle. And here we go. Let's go ahead and copy this. Pygame.draw.rect. And now for this color, we actually want to use the R value, the G value, and the B value. So what I'll do is I'll say we're going to pass 3 variables in here. We need to come down to where we call draw window, and we need to give it R value, G value, and B value. Okay? And this is gonna obviously 0, 0, 0, which is what they're at right now, is going to give us black. It's not that exciting. So I'll just put some values in here so that we can actually see like a color as we get it designed. And that's good because we'll see our text change as well. But now, instead of this second rectangle being drawn on the screen in white, we'll want it to be R, G, and B. And what you'll see, so we want this one to be solid. We want it to fill the whole space. But what you'll see with what I just did is, ooh, that's a really nasty brown. I didn't do that on purpose, but okay. All we have to do to get our border to come back is change the order of these two things. So by putting it above the border, now we've got a white rectangle around our full rectangle of color. So that's super useful. The last thing I want to do in drawing the window before we start handling user inputs is just give some text explanation of what's going on. So to do that, we'll just start with some text that I'll call, I'll just start with this first one, and I'll call it window text. And it's going to say font.render just like before. And then you give it the text you want to say, and we'll say your color is, and then I think it would be useful to show the RGB values all together so that it's clear what it is. So actually, let's go ahead and make this an F string, a formatted string, and that means that we can put variables right inside with just using these curly brackets. So this, your color is, and then the R value, and then comma, and then the G value, and then comma, and then the B value, and then close parentheses. And that should be all we have to do to get that text on the screen. So we do font.render and then all the text, and then just fill in true, and then what color we want it to be. Let's say white because it's going on a black background, and then none. And then you need the screen.blit of window text. And let's put it on the screen at width divided by 3. That's going to be a little far right, huh? Let's do width divided by 10 because that's where the window starts at 1/10. And now let's go ahead and say height divided by 4 because that's where the window starts. And let's just move it up some. So let's move it up 25 pixels so that it should sit right above the window. And we'll take a look here. I don't know if that's high enough up. We might have to, and make sure your coordinates are inside of a second set of parentheses because they're a tuple. I'm not sure that's high enough up. Yeah, so let's move it up a little bit more. Let's say 45 because this is big font. All right, there we go. So it tells you what color it is. Now let's add some instructions. Let's just keep in mind to come back to this after we've created the player controls to add some instructions to this space, telling them how to use the application. Because, you know, as the developer, it always seems pretty easy because you built it. But as the user, if nobody tells you how to use it, you're just clicking around blind. Okay, so great. The next thing I think we should do is get it to where you can actually click on and change the values inside of those buttons. So to do that, let's go ahead and just start checking in our event handling if the mouse clicked on any of those buttons. So let's say if event.type, just like we did for the quit, except now it's going to be if event.type equals pygame dot, and then this one's mouse button down. So that means you've clicked the button. And we're going to create a new function inside of our class, our button class, to check whether or not the button was just clicked. So we'll create some new variables. We'll say rActive equals, and then it'll be rButton, and we'll create a new function called check click, and it's going to give us the little error saying that it was you know it's not real. If we tried to run this right now, rActive gActive equals gbutton dot click check click. So if you try to make these variables get set inside of this function, but you don't initialize them in the very beginning, it's always going to throw an error that it was used before initialization. So just make sure you come back up here, and we'll just say rActive, gActive, and bActive are all false to start, because why would you be editing right when you open it up if you haven't even clicked on anything? All right, and so we're going to create a new function that's just going to check whether or not you clicked on these. And so all we have to do is say event.position, because the event was a mouse button click. And so if we get the event.position, we're getting the coordinates of that mouse button click as it was clicked. So what we have to do is we have to come back up into our button class, and we have to define a new function that's called check click. And it's getting self, obviously, because it's inside of a class. So you want to refer to everything that you already have inside of self. And then you also want to pass in the event.position, which in this place we'll just call coordinates. So we want to check if self.rect collides with the event position. So if self.rect dot, and this is where Pygame just makes it so easy, collide with a point, and then all we have to do is put coords in there. So that's it. We're just checking if it was clicked. And if it does, then we want to return true, and then else return false. And that's literally all we have to do to check if the button was clicked. And because we put this in a class, we just did that for all three buttons right there. Now, rActive, gActive, and bActive aren't doing anything yet, because we're not using it to draw anything. Excuse me. So what we'll do is we'll also pass the rActive, gActive, and bActive. We'll pass the active values into the variables, or into the button class, and we're going to use them to check if we should draw like a little yes I'm active rectangle around it. So we called that one text. We'll call this active, and we'll say self.active equals active. Okay? And now, while we're in here drawing the rectangle, we should also check if self.active, so if it's true that you've clicked on this button, then we should draw another rectangle, pygame.draw.rect, and it'll basically be the same as the main rectangle, but I copied the whole thing. There we go. It'll be the same as the main rectangle, but we want this to just have a border that we'll make like 8, just so it really pops. And instead of self.color, we'll just want it to be something that, I don't know, I guess white might look okay. Let's take a look at that. Excuse me. Okay, but so that should at least let us click on a button and see if it's active. But then one thing I want to handle outside of the loop is just if rActive, then I want gActive to be equal to false and bActive equal to false. And this is going to make it to where you can't have multiple active colors at the same time, because you don't want to be editing all of your colors at the same time. So make this little, and there's a way that you could handle this inside the loop, but you would then you'd have to change up a lot more stuff. You'd have to reference all 3 active colors if you wanted to make it smart to where it could check and see how many different things it had to deactivate. This is really a simple piece of code to put out here. You could even use these elifs if you want, but 3 if statements is going to do it fine. But that should be all we need. So now let's go ahead. I click on 100 and we get this deep white border. If I click on green, if I click on blue, it's not just setting that one equal to active, it's also saying the other 2 equal to inactive, which is a useful bit of trickery. Okay, so that's cool. It's active, but we can't edit it yet. We haven't made a variable, we haven't made the value configurable. So what we need to do next, and I'm just going to I'm going to add, I think, a new value that'll be like the temporary entry. So if you've selected one of these, then we're going to say we have an active entry. And it's just going to be a true-false variable that's true if R is active, or G is active, or B is active. So that just means you've selected something. But you'll see why that's important when we get into the nitty-gritty. And so to start, because you want to initialize pretty much every one of your variables right up here in the top. But what we'll do is we'll say, okay, now if you're pressing the keyboard, so if event.type is equal to key down, it's pygame.keydown, pygame.keydown, and active entry. Okay, so if you don't have an active entry, we don't care if you click the screen. If you click buttons, it's not going to do anything. But if you press a key and we have an active entry, then we need to start doing some math. So we'll say if event.unicode.isDigit. Okay, so this is a specific kind of Pygame tool to check if what you just pressed was numerical. And we're going to want a new variable called entry while we're working on the a new value, but you haven't entered it yet. Because if we just took the character as soon as you clicked it, then it would just immediately overwrite, but you'd only be able to write single-digit values. And obviously, we want to be able to go 0 to 255. So we need to just check a few things in here. So to start, we'll have that entry value that's going to be equal to just an empty string. Okay. And then, so if you press a numerical code, and we'll say the length of entry. So we'll make it a string because we can check the length of that a little bit easier. But if you press a number and the length of our entry is less than 3, because that's the most possible characters that something could be, that's basically our minimum criteria for checking if it was a valid entry. Then what we'll do is we'll set entry equal to, and then the string of event.unicode. So that's its number, 0 through 9. And then that's all we're going to have to do for entry, but we should also make it to where you can back out. So if event.key, and it's, if event.key is equal to pygame.k backspace. Okay, so this is like, oop, I hit a key I didn't want to hit. And the length of the entry this time has to be greater than 0. So this means it can't just be an empty string. There's got to be something inside of there. Then what we'll do is we will say entry equals, and there's not actually a super easy way in Pygame to just pop one character out of a string. So what we're going to do is we're going to do entry.replace. And this is a Python tool for manipulating strings. And what we're going to do is we're going to replace all of the entry text with a new string that is equal to the entry from the very beginning to the next to last character. So that's what this kind of string manipulation nomenclature is. If you're not real familiar with Python or object-oriented programming, there's a whole series on how to manipulate strings and beginner Python tutorials on the channel. You can check this out if you don't understand it. But if you're just following along, understand this is how you replace the entire string with the same exact string minus the last character. Okay, so this is going to allow us to enter and then also to backspace. And I think the next thing we should do is the actual if you want to escape. So we'll say if event.key is equal to pygame.k escape. This would be like you didn't mean to change it, you don't like the value that you entered, and you just want to leave it alone. Then what we want to do is we want to set active entry equal to false, but then we also want all of the individuals to be equal to false. So R active, G active, and B active should all be equal to false in this case. And we're just saying like, oh, I didn't mean to select anything. So real quick, we won't have it change the number just yet, but I do want to show somewhere on the screen that what's happening. So we'll say if self.active, and then we'll also, I think we should pass in entry to all of them. So to all of our buttons in this class, we'll pass in the entry. We'll pass in the entry, and we'll pass in the entry. And the reason we're going to do that is we've already got a check to see if it's active. And if it is active, then we also want to know what's going on you know, in the outside world, like what buttons are being pressed and selected, things like that. So to do that, just underneath this self.active check where we're already drawing it in, what we'll do is we'll say entry text equals, and we now have another variable in here. So we'll call this new value, I guess. I don't love that, but whatever. Self.new value is going to be equal to new value. Okay. And you could just call it entry. You're going to get a little like, actually, we should initialize self.rect up here too. That's fine. It's going to tell you like, it shadows the name from the outside world if you call this entry, if you call this width, if you call it height, but you can still do it that way if it's easier for you. I like to use different names, but that's just me. Okay, so what we'll do is we'll say the entry text is equal to, and then we'll say font.render. And now we're drawing on the button, so we need to be mindful to avoid our initial text. But all we're doing is we're entering a value between 0 and 255, hopefully. So we'll make this another formatted. We'll do this the other way so you can see two types of string concatenation in here. So what we're going to say is the new value is going to be equal to some brackets, so or parentheses, not brackets, with the string conversion. Goodness, excuse me. With the string conversion of the entry inside of these parentheses, and then we'll just say true. We'll call it black, and we'll put it on the screen. And then the second piece, as always, is self.blit entry text. And what we'll do is we'll say, so we want this to go pretty close to where the other text was, but we want it to be clear that it's like temporary or it's a work in progress. So we'll say self.x position, and we'll move this to the right a fair bit. We'll move it 70 pixels to the right, and then self.y position, and we'll move it down 50 pixels. And we'll just see if that looks okay. So, did I get my parentheses wrong? It looks like I did. There we go. Okay, and so this is going to be only somewhat useful because we haven't created any like code to actually change the entry yet, but I just want us to be able to see. So, color button has no attribute blit. What? I don't think I did color button blit. A little bit of troubleshooting never hurt anybody. Oh, self.blit. It is screen.blit. So there we go. I was trying to draw the whole button. Okay, so if I click on 100 and I click 234, and now I'll try to type more numbers, and it's not working because we're at our max. I'm going to hit backspace. It goes back to 23. Hit backspace again. Great. Now if I click over to 5 or whatever, I change my number. I can only change it up to 3, which is cool. I can go forward, I can go back, I can change them, and we get this temporary looking text. I actually think maybe to distinguish between between like the active text and the text that we're writing. Let's make a new gray value, and we will go ahead and make the temporary entry. So in our button.draw, instead of this being black text, we'll make it gray text just to distinguish. But a really important piece now is going to be, should we take the change or not? Should we accept the new value or no? And to do that, we'll say if you hit enter, then we'll accept the change. But if you don't, then we'll delete the change. So let's make a new value, a new variable that I'll say take change, and it'll be equal to false initially. And let's go ahead down to our event handling, and we will just say if event.key equals pygame dot, and this has been the bane of many people's existence because there is no k enter, it's return. And that's just because old keyboards, that was the return button. I think it's actually like a relic from typewriter age, but it's k return, not k enter. But then we also want to check that the length of the entry is greater than 0. So you've got to enter something more than 0 keys long. And all we'll do in there is we'll set take change equal to true. Okay, and now I actually think the best place to handle take change will be inside of our active function right here, because it's already handling you know, setting others equal to false. So what we'll do is we'll say if length of entry is greater than 0 and take change is true, if the, actually let's do it this way, and take change is true, and the integer conversion of entry, so now we've got it as a string, making sure there's something in there, and the integer entry is less than 256, and the integer version of entry is greater than -1. Okay, so this is actually, we'll do greater than or equal to 0 because that -1 looks stupid. But this is how we're checking to make sure there's something in the entry value, and it's time to accept a value, and it's a valid number. So if it's a valid number, actually, you know what, we're going to want to do these ones separate. So we'll do if entry is less than, so this is checking to make sure it's a valid entry, but the reason I wanted to do that is no matter what, when it's time to take change, we want take change to be set equal to false. So equals false. Okay, because no matter what, when we hit enter, we want whatever value was in there to get cleared out, even if it was a garbage value. So now what we'll say is if it was a valid entry, which is this first one, then we want our value to be equal to the integer conversion of the entry. Nope, I got a 9. Okay, so let me see. Simplify change to expression. Yeah, that's a better way of doing it. Okay, so we'll have it take the change, and then what else we'll do is we'll set our active equal to false, and then we will also clear out the entry. So we'll say, all right, you've done it. And I'm hitting backspace, not delete. Okay, so that should be all we have to do, but let's go ahead and just copy this whole blurb into all three of them. And you may be at the point where you're like, hey, Pete, isn't this the sort of thing you said you should do inside of a function? And you're like, yep, it could be. You could definitely move all of this all of this code into a shared function. It's just kind of, we started building it out down here, and it's not particularly hard code, and it's not particularly hard to copy paste. So you could for sure clean this up and move it into its own section, but I'm going to leave it here. So let's take a look and see if we actually can change colors now. So let's say instead of 100, I want 120, and I'm going to hit enter, and it changed to 120, and the color actually changed. So let's say 90, enter. All right, it's like a vomit. I am picking the worst colors. Okay, we got like a nice lavender. That's decent at least. So this is sweet. We're changing colors. That's the whole point here, is so that you can design colors and you can find mint toothpaste if you want. And you can say like, oh, I'm at 90. It just needs to be a little softer on the reds. Go down to 70, go down to 80, whatever. You can really hone these things in. One more really useful piece that I think could take this the extra mile. Let's say when you press the space bar, you want to save the value. So if event.key, because that's an important thing here, is if you really like a color, you should be able to print it to the terminal and then take that color with you. So you know, like, you know, if you're using this application to pick colors for a game that you're going to build, remembering what colors you really liked are going to be super important going forward. So what we'll say is if event.key equals, we're still in the key down space, and this one actually won't require active entry. So let's go ahead back here and do another line like this. And we'll just say if event.key is key down and pygame and event.key equals pygame.k space. Okay, so now we moved this out because the other keys that you're pressing only matter when there's an active entry, but space should be anytime. You like the color, you hit space, it's going to print the current color to the console. So we'll just do print and then a formatted string, and we'll say f and then curly brackets r value, and then comma, and then curly brackets g value, and then comma, curly brackets b value, and then close the parentheses. And it would probably look good with some spaces. So let's go ahead and test that. All right, 100, we'll go up to 180. Cool. Let's say I really like this 180, 50, 30. 180, 50, 30 prints out over here on the console. When I'm done with my little app checker, whatever, I can copy all these RGB values I liked, and I can move them, you know, into my game or whatever. All we're really doing here is learning some Python, learning some Pygame, and you know, creating a useful little application. So yes, there are a million RGB color pickers and color wheels on the internet, but this is a nice little way of doing things as well. So one more thing that I think would be super useful, and I'm actually just going to copy them in because I did this before. I think adding some instructions to your window. So I'm going to just call this like instructions block. And you don't want to sit here for 10 minutes and watch me just type in text, but I'll explain what I'm doing real quick. I want to have them know, like just booting up the app, it's going to be click the value you want to modify and enter something 0 to 255. Press enter to keep the value or escape to cancel it, and then press space to print value to terminal and throw them on the screen in that black space at the bottom of the screen. I think that's a really useful addition. I think that, you know, that telling people how to use your app is really important. They're not the ones who designed it. So with that being said, this is really the whole thing. I hope you guys found it useful. If you have watched this far, thank you so much for following along. Thank you for watching the channel. Please consider subscribing, like the video. It helps me out a ton. If you have any questions about anything you saw in here or something you want to see in a future video, let me know about it in the comments below. I really appreciate your support. It's been a lot of fun making these videos, and I want to keep making stuff for you guys just like this. So good luck with your code, and thanks for watching. Thanks. Bye.